Hello class, today we're going to talk about this new data type in Java. So far we've talked about all these primitive data types. We've talked about ints and floats and doubles and longs. There's 8 different kinds of primitive data types. We've talked about one kind of object we have, or one kind of data type that's a string, right? String data types. We talked about random objects. We've talked about scanner objects. This is another kind of data type called an array, and we're going to see today that it's actually very similar to Python lists, but today what I want to kind of highlight is things that are similar to the Python list and then things that are not similar. Okay, so let's kind of get into it. So what is an array? An array is an object that is used to store a list of values. And notice I'm even using the word list here, a list of values. And it's made out of a contiguous block of memory. Contiguous means continuous. And so we could kind of visualize it in memory like this. So it's all connected. So if this is, say, address 0, then this address 1, address 2, or maybe address 1000, then address 1001, address 1002, something like that, a contiguous block of memory. And this block of memory is divided into cells, into elements, and each element holds a value. And so this has very kind of similar ideas to a Python list in a sense, but in a Python list we didn't necessarily think of it as a contiguous block of memory, and in Java, an array, it is a contiguous block of memory, whereas in Python it was never stated, even though it probably is underneath the hood in some way, in some manner, a contiguous block. But that's kind of a detail that's not really important for Python. Whereas in Java, I think it's a kind of an important definition of an array where it is a contiguous block of memory. And in this example here, I gave a variable name to it. Data is the name of this block, this object. And notice that every cell is given a number, in index. So we use the same word index as the address. So data 0 up to 9 here. This is 10 different elements. And so in a very similar way, I'll highlight this in green. This is the exact same way we reference one of the cells within our array. Data bracket 5, bracket. That references the 14 right here. Now, this is where things are different. In Java, every single item in here must be of the same data type. So I can't have the first one to be an integer and the second one being a double, then the next one being a turtle, and then the next one being a string. In a Python list, I can make them whatever I want. I could add a turtle, then I could add a string, then I can add an integer, etc. But in Python, they must all be the same. In Java, they must all be the same. So I'm going to highlight that in red because it's different than Python. Okay, so how do we make an array? There's 2 steps. One is the declaration of that variable. So notice, we have our variable name here, and we say that it is an array type. So this bracket says it's an array of whatever here. So in this case here, my variable name is data. It's an array of integers. So that's the declaration side. Then on the right-hand side, we need to actually make it. We're actually creating it. We're constructing the array object, and we're using the word new here. So we've seen this before in other cases earlier. where we use this word new to say, I want to make a new array. The brackets, when you see the brackets, think array of this type. So in this case, I have an array of integers of size 10. And so when we make an array, we're specifying up front how big that array is. And once we make that array of size 10, it's fixed in size. And I'll write that here. It's fixed size. And I'll put that also in kind of a red color. The array does not change in size. It is always of size 10 when we make it, in this example, of size 10. Never bigger, never smaller. And what it will do when we do this, Java will initialize every cell to be initialized with an entry of 0 in this case. Okay, so now when we index, the index must have a value from 0 to size minus 1. So this is also different. Remember, in Python, I could actually use this -1, and -1 would mean the last element in our list. But not so in Java. This is no good. NG, no good. Data 0 is fine. That's legal. 1.5 is illegal. That's the same as Python. We could not do this in Python. Data 9 is okay, but data 10 is not okay because, there's only valid indexes 0 through 9. And just like in Python, this is illegal. So this is the only twist, the only difference in terms of indexing. Now, if you did one of these illegal values, like one of these like 10, for example, the program will stop. You'll get an exception error, an index exception error. Your program will just crash. Again, similar to the way Python operated. Okay, so when we make an array, there's actually another way of making an array. This is an alternative way. Normally, when we make the array, zeros will be put into every single cell. But as an alternative, notice here, I've declared my array on the left-hand side. It's an integer array named data. And this is going to be my integer array. It's going to make it of size 5. And in this particular case, I don't actually need to specify how big it is because it's implicit here. It's implied by this statement right here that there are 5 different elements. And instead of initializing it to 0, it will now initialize it to 4, 7, 9, 0, and 1. Okay, so why don't you practice on this? Write a very small program that creates an array of size 100. And what it does is it puts the first 100 odd numbers into that array using a for loop. Okay, so I'll give you a little bit of time, and then we'll go through the answer. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so let's look at that. So I'm going to make my integer array. I'll name it odd num. And this is, so I declared it on this side, and now I'm going to initialize it or instantiate it here, create the new integer array of size 100. Now I'm going to have a little for loop here. And I'll use index IDX as my loop variable. I'm going to start from 0. I'm going to go all the way up to, but not including 100, and I'm going to increment it every time through my loop. And what will I do? I'm going to generate all the odd numbers, and this is the way, I'm going to use this little formula as a way of doing it. And let me just talk about that for a second. So what I want to do is create the numbers 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, ... Now, those are my odd numbers. And I have my index 0, 1, 2, 3. So I need to figure out some formula to go from 0 to 1, 1 to 3, 2 to 5. And so using kind of my algebra skills, my arithmetic sequence skills that I learned in Algebra 2 Trig, I can come up with this formula here to map these numbers here into these numbers here. Now, suppose I kind of wasn't so smart. I couldn't remember how to do that. My algebra skills are a little shaky. So then in that case, I could do the following. I could create a variable, and I'll just do that here. I'll do something like this. I'll say int odd equals 1. So I'm going to initialize it to my first value here. And so then I'm going to delete this piece right here, and I'm going to change that to odd. So I'm going to just assign it here to 1. And then what I want to do is every time I'm going to increment it by 2. So after I've assigned it into my array, I'm going to increment my variable by 2. And so I also need to put these curly brackets here. So that way all of this is inside my loop. And so this variable here, you could see that it's being incremented 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. And this is a nice convenient way of doing it without having to think about a formula. Okay? So that's the lesson for today. I'll be signing off. Bye, everybody.